The first thing I heard was not what I expected an army to sound like. No drums, no horns, no battle cries, just a sound like the world groaning, like stone shifting somewhere deep below the ground, like a forest in a storm, except there was no storm, and there had been no forest near Isengard for 20 years, because we had cut it all down for the furnaces. That was the first thing. That sound. Coming from the north. Coming closer. And none of us knew what it was. By the time we knew, it was too late. My name is Grish. I served in Isengard for 31 years under Saruman the White, who became Saruman of many colors, who became Saruman the traitor, who became Saruman with a broken staff standing in a tower surrounded by wreckage, while the things that had broken everything stood in the water below and watched him with eyes like old wood. I was there for all of it. I survived things that killed most of the others, and I am telling you now what it looked like from the inside. What Isengard was before that night, what happened when the forest came, and what I saw on Saruman's face when it was over. That last part is the part that matters most. Remember that. You need to understand what Isengard was before I can tell you what it became and what it lost. Because from the outside, from the histories that men write about wars they watched from a distance, Isengard is just the place Saruman built his army. The industrial fortress, the ring of stone and fire, the thing that produced the Uruk-hai, who nearly took the Hornburg, a mechanism, a factory for war. From the inside, it was something else. I came to Isengard when I was young, younger than I should have been for the work they put me to, but orcs mature faster than men, and the work needed doing, and there were never enough hands. I had been living in the Misty Mountains before that, in a clan that was hungry most of the time, and fighting most of the rest. Isengard was better, but that is not a high bar to clear, but it cleared it. There was food, regular food. There was work that was hard but purposeful. There were walls that kept the things outside from coming in. And there was, in the early years before I understood what I was looking at, a sense that something was being built. Something real. Something that would matter. Saruman had been in Orthanc for a long time before I arrived. The tower had been there longer still, built by men in an age before Saruman came to it. Black stone so hard that nothing we had could scratch it, and so tall that on clear days you could see the Misty Mountains from its upper windows. Or so the ones who had been up there said. I never went up. The tower was his. The ring of Isengard below it was ours, in the sense that we lived and worked there, not in any sense that involved ownership or choice. The early years were mining and cutting and clearing and building. Isengard had been a green place once. There were stories, was among the older workers, about what it had looked like when Saruman first came. Trees, gardens, the river running clean through it. He had kept it that way for a long time, apparently, living quietly in the tower, receiving visitors, conducting whatever business wizards conduct. And then something changed. Something shifted in his thinking, or his planning, or his understanding of what was coming. And the green things started coming down, and the stone and the iron started going up, and by the time I arrived, the transformation was well underway. The forges were the heart of it. Great furnaces dug into the ground beneath the floor of Isengard, fed by the river that had been diverted, to drive the bellows and cool the metal. They burned day and night. The heat from them was constant, even in the upper levels of the ring, a warmth that in winter was almost welcome, and in summer was punishing. What they produced everything, weapons, armor, The tools that built more forges, the machinery of war assembled piece by piece over years of work until Isengard was not just a fortress, but a production facility of a kind that nothing in Middle-earth had seen before. I worked in the forges for 12 years, then in the tunnels that ran beneath them, where the ore was processed before it went to the flames. Hard work, dangerous work. Men died in those tunnels regularly, as overcome by heat or gas or structural collapses that the engineers had not anticipated. Orcs died too, though we were hardier and the tolerance for our losses was higher. I survived because I was careful, and because I learned quickly which sections of tunnel were safe and which were not, and I did not go into the unsafe ones regardless of what I was told. This carefulness made me useful in a different way eventually, and I became one of the ones who assessed new tunnel sections before the general workforce was sent in. Not a foreman exactly, more of a canary, though a canary that could report back what it found rather than just dying. It was better work than the forges, more interesting, and it meant that by the time the Ents came, I knew the tunnel system beneath Isengard better than almost anyone alive. That knowledge is why I am alive now to tell this story. Isengard, at its height, what in the years just before the war fully broke, held perhaps 10,000 souls, orcs and Uruk-hai mostly. Some men who had thrown their lot in with Saruman for reasons of their own. Some half-breeds who did not fit comfortably anywhere else. A few specialists, smiths and engineers and the like, who had come for wages and stayed because leaving was difficult once you knew what was being built there. 10,000 people are eating and sleeping and working and arguing and doing all the things that 10,000 people do when they are crowded together inside a ring of stone. It was not a comfortable life. I want to be clear about that. The food was adequate, and the walls were solid, and there was a kind of rough order maintained by the hierarchy that Saruman had established among us. But comfortable is not the word. It was purposeful. We were building something, working toward something. Even those of us who did not know exactly what that something was could feel the momentum of it. The sense that all this work, all this heat and noise and effort and death in collapsed tunnels was adding up to something that would eventually matter. I believed this. Most of us believed this. That is important to understand. We were not slaves exactly. We could not leave easily. But most of us did not want to leave. We had invested in the place, given it our years. Whatever it was going to become, we were going to be part of it. That was the implicit promise of Isengard. That was what kept 10,000 creatures working in the heat and the dark for years without open revolt. The promise was a lie, but we did not know that yet. The night the Ents came had been an ordinary day, up until it wasn't. The main Uruk-hai force had marched for Rohan some time before. Isengard was quieter than usual, a strange emptiness in the ring where thousands of soldiers had been camped and trained and fed. Those of us who remained were the workers, the builders and the miners and the forge hands and the engineers. Not fighters, most of us. Not what anyone would call an army. We were not expecting an attack. Why would we? Isengard had never been attacked. Its walls were the strongest thing in that part of the world. The tower was impregnable, and Saruman was in it. Whatever else you said about him, and there were things you said quietly among yourselves when you were sure no one was listening, he was powerful, the kind of powerful that made attacks seem like poor ideas. I was in the tunnel system when the sound started, 3 levels down, checking the structural integrity of a new section that the engineers wanted, cleared for expanded ore processing. The sound reached me as a vibration, before it was a sound at all, a trembling in the stone beneath my feet. Faint at first, rhythmic, but not the rhythm of machinery, which I knew as well as my own heartbeat after years in the tunnels. Something else, something organic, something that had the cadence of footsteps, but footsteps at a scale that made no sense. I came up fast, faster than was safe in the tunnel system, because the vibration was getting stronger and stronger things than vibrations had taught me to trust instinct over protocol. By the time I came out into the open ring, the sound was audible above ground as well. That deep groaning, like the earth considering something, like old wood under enormous stress. And I could see others emerging from buildings and tunnels, and the entrances to the forge levels, all of us looking north, all of us trying to understand what we were hearing. The first Ent came through the north gate, like the gate was not there. I do not mean it broke the gate down. I mean, it came through the gate the way you come through a doorway, without ceremony, without particular effort, as if the gate was simply an obstacle of the appropriate size for the obstacle-clearing capacity it had brought with it. The iron and the stone, and the mechanisms that held the gate closed, things that had seemed permanent and solid and proof against anything short of a siege engine, came apart as the Ent moved through them and fell to either side as rubble, whereas the Ent itself was already past them and moving into the ring before the sound of the collapse had finished echoing off the walls. It was tall. I knew trees were tall. I had cut enough of them down over the years to have a sense of their scale. But a standing tree is a different thing from a moving one. A standing tree is scenery. A moving Ent is something for which I do not have adequate words in any language I speak. It was the height of several men. Its limbs were thick as old oaks. It moved with a deliberateness that was almost slow until you understood that each step covered the ground that would take you or me 20 steps to cover. And then the deliberateness resolved into something that was not slow at all, but simply operating at a different scale from everything you were accustomed to measuring speed against. And its face. I saw its face when it turned to look at the ring it had just entered, and I understood something immediately that I have tried to explain to other orcs since, and have never fully managed. It was not angry. I had expected anger, the mindless, destructive rage that I associated with things that attacked walls. It was not that. It was something colder and more considered. It was judgment. The face of something that had made a decision after long deliberation and had now arrived at the point of executing it, and was entirely at peace with what it was about to do. That was more frightening than rage would have been. Rage burns itself out. Judgment does not. More came behind it. I counted 8 before I stopped counting and started running. They came through the north gate and over the north wall, where the gate had been in their way, and through sections of the wall itself, where the wall had been inconvenient, and they spread out into the ring of Isengard with that same deliberate scale and that same quality of considered purpose. And they began to work. Or the word work is the right word. They were not attacking randomly. They moved to specific things. The great pumping machinery that drove the bellows for the furnaces. The wheel houses where the river's flow was captured and directed to power the industrial processes of the ring. The crane mechanisms that moved ore from the processing areas to the forge levels. The things that made Isengard a functioning engine rather than just a walled space. That they went for the machinery with a systematic attention that made it clear they understood what they were looking at, that they had assessed it in advance, or been told about it, or simply perceived with their ancient intelligence what the purpose of each piece of equipment was, and had decided it needed to be removed. We ran. There is nothing else to say about that. We ran from the Ents because there was nothing else to do. The Uruk-hai who had remained in Isengard, the few thousand who had not marched for Rohan, formed up in some sections of the ring and tried to fight, which I will say was genuinely brave and genuinely pointless. Spears that could kill men did nothing to creatures that were made of wood and age, and the accumulated patience of thousands of years. The Ents were not unaware of the attacks. They simply were not affected by them in any way that changed what they were doing. I went back into the tunnels. It was not a decision exactly, but more a reversion to instinct, to the thing I knew better than anything else. The tunnels were mine. I understood them. And I had identified, over years of work, sections of the tunnel system that were structurally independent of the surface features above them. Sections where even a significant collapse at ground level would not necessarily bring down the ceiling below. I had identified these sections for my own reasons, not the reasons of a creature who worked in dangerous underground spaces and thought carefully about where the safe places were. Now those reasons became the reason I survived. I pulled 3 others in with me as I went. I did not know all of them well. One was a young orc who worked the ore carts on my level, who I had noticed was competent and calm in the tunnel emergencies that happened periodically. One was an engineer, a man actually, who had come to Isengard 5 years earlier, and who knew the structural plans of the tunnel system because he had helped design the later sections. One was an older Uruk-hai, whose name I never learned, and whose function in Isengard I had never been sure of, but who was moving in the right direction when I was moving in the right direction, and who I didn't have time to be selective about. We went down 3 levels, to the section I had identified as safest, a horizontal passage running east to west that had been cut through solid granite and was reinforced with stone arches that the engineer had designed, and that he now, crouching in the dark beside me, told me would hold against anything short of the mountain falling on them. I asked him if he thought the mountain was going to fall on them. He said he did not know. That was honest. I respected it. Then the water came. You think you understand water. You have seen rivers and rain, and the flooding that happens in low country when the weather turns bad. You understand water as something that moves through the landscape, that fills spaces and finds levels and behaves according to its nature. You do not understand water until you are underground when a river is redirected into the space above you. We heard it before we felt it. A sound like nothing I have heard before or since. The deep grinding of the river's course being changed, or somewhere above and to the north, the water finding the new path that the Ents had opened for it, and then the sound of that water moving. Not the sound of a river flowing, the sound of a river falling, of a volume of water that had been contained and directed, suddenly released to go where gravity wanted it to go, which was down, which was into the tunnels and the forge levels and the spaces beneath Isengard that the Ents had not been able to reach with their hands. The engineer grabbed my arm in the dark. He said, "The forge levels will go first. The intake channels run directly from the river. When the river changes course, the intakes become outlets." I thought about the forge levels, about the hundreds of orcs who worked them and lived in the chambers adjacent to them, about the tunnels I knew that connected to those levels, the ones I had assessed as unsafe because of their proximity to the river intake structures, about the people who were in those tunnels right now, in the dark, in the noise, not knowing what was coming. There was nothing I could do for them. I want to say that plainly. Not as an excuse, as a fact. The water moved faster than any warning I could have given. It hit the forge levels like a fist. We felt it even 3 levels above, even in solid granite, as a shuddering that ran through the stone, and a sound that was not quite an explosion and not quite a collapse, but something between them. The sound of heat and water meeting violently. The forge fires had been burning for years without interruption. The water hit them, and the steam that resulted had nowhere to go, except through the tunnels and the chambers and the passages connecting everything. And steam in an enclosed space is a different kind of death from drowning, but it is not a better one. Then the water itself came up to our level. Not as a wave exactly, more as a rising. It came in through the passage connections that linked our section to the sections below it, cold and fast and indifferent, filling from the floor up with a speed that gave you enough time to understand what was happening, but not enough time to do anything useful about it, except get higher. We got higher. The passage we were in had a section where the floor rose sharply before the next arch, and we pressed ourselves into that elevated section and watched the water rise around us and held ourselves above it with our backs against the stone and waited. The young orc, the cart worker, panicked. I held him, not gently. There was no room for gentle, and I held him and told him in the flat, specific way that tends to cut through panic, that if he struggled, he would take us both into the water, and we would both die. And if he was still, he might live. And those were the options. He was still. He was shaking, but he was still. The engineer was calm in a way that was either genuine or an excellent performance of genuine, and either was fine. The Uruk-hai, whose name I never learned, had gotten above the waterline ahead of the rest of us, and was watching us from the higher ground with an expression I could not fully read in the dark. The water rose to within a foot of where we were pressed against the arch, and then stopped rising. Stayed there for what felt like hours. The sound from above and below and in all directions was a continuous roar of water moving through spaces it had not been designed to move through, of the creak and crash of things collapsing, and underneath all of it, occasionally, sounds that I understood were people and tried not to think about as people. Then the water began to fall, slowly, draining into the lower levels and through whatever exits it found in the outer walls of Isengard, falling back toward the level it would settle at when the new configuration of the river found its equilibrium. The roaring diminished. The crashes became less frequent. The stone stopped shaking, and it was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists after very loud things have stopped, a quiet that has the shape of the noise that came before it. We waited another hour before we moved. The engineer suggested it, and the engineer knew the tunnels, so we waited. And then we went up. What Isengard looked like the morning after the Ents came is something I have tried to describe to people who were not there and have not managed to convey adequately. Or descriptions of destruction tend to sound like lists. This was broken. That was collapsed. The water was here. The Ents were there. The descriptions are accurate, and they do not capture it. What it felt like was erasure. 30 years of work. 30 years of mining and cutting and building and maintaining and expanding. The forges that had burned without interruption for a decade. The machinery that had seemed permanent, or that had become part of the landscape so completely that imagining Isengard without it was like imagining the sky without height. All of it was either gone or so damaged as to be indistinguishable from gone. The ring that had held 10,000 people was full of water and mud and wreckage. The walls that had seemed impregnable had sections missing where the Ents had simply removed them. The great gates that had never been breached lay in pieces, and it was quiet. That was the strangest thing. But Isengard had not been quiet in 30 years. The forges had seen to that. The constant industrial noise of a place that ran without rest. Now it was quiet in a way that felt wrong, because I had no memory of it being quiet, and so the quiet seemed like an absence of something fundamental, like silence in a place where silence should not be possible. There were survivors. Not many, but some. I found them in groups of 2 and 3 in the hours after I emerged from the tunnels, moving through the wreckage and the mud with the particular dazed quality of people whose understanding of their situation had not yet caught up with their situation. We gathered together without quite deciding to, the way animals gather after a storm. Not for warmth exactly, for the reassurance of presence, of others who had seen the same thing and were still standing. I do not know how many died. I never found out, but the numbers I have heard from people who claim to know vary so widely that I distrust all of them. What I know is that of the people I had worked alongside for years, the ones I knew by face and name and function, most of them were gone. The tunnels below the ring held them, or the steam had taken them, or the water in the sections that had flooded completely, sections that I know did not drain fully for days. The Ents were still there when I came up, standing in the water, most of them, in the shallow flooding that covered most of the ring's floor. They were not moving much, not talking that I could hear, just standing. The quality of judgment that I had seen on the first one's face when it came through the gate was still there, but quieter now. Satisfied, perhaps. The word sounds wrong for creatures like that, but it was the closest word I had. They did not pay attention to those of us who were moving through the wreckage. Not obviously, but I had the sense, a sense I could not fully justify, that they knew where each of us was, that nothing in the ring escaped their awareness, that they were allowing us to move through the ruins because we were not doing anything they wanted to stop. And I was careful, very careful, not to do anything they might want to stop. And then I looked up at the tower. Orthanc stood. Of course it stood. The tower was old and hard, and nothing the Ents had done had marked it. The black stone was as it had always been, absolute, indifferent to everything around it. And Saruman was at a window, high up, looking down at what his fortress had become. I was far below him, and the light was the grey light of early morning, and I cannot claim I could see his expression with any certainty. But I could see him, a figure in white at a high window looking down, still, watching. And I had the thought that I haven't been able to get rid of in all the years since. I had the thought that he was not looking at what I was looking at. I was looking at the dead, at the wreckage, at 30 years of work turned to mud and rubble, at the absence of people I had known. When I looked at Isengard that morning, I saw all of that. The human or the orc weight of it, the specific losses that the general destruction contained. He was not looking at that. I believe this as certainly as I believe anything. He was looking at the machinery, at the forges, at the production capacity that had been destroyed, calculating what it would take to rebuild, whether it could be rebuilt, what the loss of it meant for the plans he had made that depended on the output it had produced. He was doing an assessment, a cold and thorough assessment of what remained and what was recoverable and what was gone beyond recovery. The people in the tunnels were not part of that assessment. They could not be, because they were not the kind of thing that featured in the calculations he was making. They were inputs. They had been used to produce the outputs he needed. The outputs were gone. The inputs that had been expended in producing them were gone with them. This was a loss of resources, not a loss of anything that registered the way the machinery registered. I stood in the mud and the water of what had been Isengard, and I looked up at the figure in the tower, and I understood something that I should have understood 30 years earlier, and that I had been, in some part of myself, that preferred not to know, not understanding deliberately. We had never been anything to him except what we could do. The 30 years I had given, the tunnel assessments, and the forge work, and the years of being careful and useful and reliable, or the others who had given the same or more, who were in the tunnels now and would not be coming out. We had been labor. We had been production capacity. We had been, in the ledger he kept in his vast and calculating mind, a resource that he had drawn on and now couldn't draw on because it had been expended. There was no grief in that window. There was calculation, and the calculation was already moving forward, past what had been lost, toward what might yet be salvaged. I looked away. I did not look back up at the tower again. I left Isengard that day, walked out through a gap in the western wall that the Ents had made, through the mud and the wreckage, and I did not look back. I had nowhere specific to go. I went west and then north, and found eventually a place in the misty mountains that was not too cold and not too exposed, and where no one was looking for me, and I have been in that general area since. It is not comfortable. It is not purposeful in any directed way, but it is mine, in the sense that I am not building something for someone else, and that turns out to matter more than I had previously understood. I think about Isengard sometimes, about what it was before the Ents came, about the 10 years of building before I arrived, and the 30 years I spent there, and the night that ended it. I think about the people in the tunnels. Not always, not every day, but they come back in the way that specific things do when you have tried not to think about them. And I think about Saruman in the tower, about what I saw in that window, or what I believe I saw, or what I have constructed from what I saw and what I know, and the 30 years of context that surrounded that moment. I think about a mind so focused on its own purposes that the people serving those purposes had no weight in it beyond their function. And I think about how long it took me to understand that. How completely I had believed for 3 decades in the implicit promise that I was part of something, that my investment in the place meant the place had an investment in me. It did not. He did not. The tower stood and we drowned, and the tower standing was the thing that mattered, and us drowning was not. This is not a lesson I recommend learning the way I learned it. But if I had to say what I took from Isengard, from all of it, from the years in the tunnels, and the night the Ents came, and the figure in the window, and the walk out through the gap in the western wall, it would be this. Power that does not see you is not power you are part of. It is power you are under. There is a difference, and the difference is what you discover when the water rises. I served Saruman for 31 years. We drowned together, in the sense that Isengard drowned. He survived it, up in his tower, dry and calculating. I survived it in the tunnels, in the dark, holding a panicking orc above the waterline. We both came out of it alive, but only one of us came out of it changed. My name is Grish. I was at Isengard when the Ents came. I was there for all of it. And I am telling you, from the other side of it, that the histories that call the flooding of Isengard a victory are not wrong. It was a victory. For the Ents, for the world that the Ents were protecting, and for the free peoples who did not have to face the army that Isengard would have kept producing. It was not a victory for the ones who were in the tunnels. They do not appear in the histories at all. They were just gone. Workers in a place that became a battlefield, who had no say in what the place was used for, and no warning when it was turned against. The histories do not count them. I do. I have counted them every year since, in the way that survivors count the ones who did not survive, but not from guilt exactly, from the refusal to let them be only the water. They were people, orcs and men and Uruk-hai and everything else that worked the ring of Isengard. They had names and histories and reasons they were there, and things they would have done if they had gotten out. They mattered in the way that all people matter, which is not negotiable, which does not change based on who they served or what they were, or whether the histories of the victors had any reason to remember them. I remember them. That is all I have. That is what I offer. The memory of the ones the water took. And the account of what it looked like from the inside on the night the forest came for the fortress, and the long 31 years that led up to it. So you know. So someone knows. So the history that says Isengard fell in a night understands that the night was made of years, and the years were made of people, and the people are gone now, and someone should have said so. Someone is saying so now,